The pandemic-era border policy known as Title 42 is coming to an end tonight. It was put in place in March of 2020 by the Trump administration and allows officials to turn away migrants on public health grounds. CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez is in El Paso, Texas, with more.
Today will mark a major change in U.S. policy here along the U.S.-Mexico border. In just a few hours, the Biden administration is set to end the Title 42 pandemic-era restrictions on migration that have allowed officials to rapidly expel hundreds of thousands of migrants to Mexico. In the coming days, U.S. officials expect to see a sharp increase in migration. In fact, border arrivals have already soared to upwards of 10,000 migrant arrivals per day. And Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz tells us that another 60,000 migrants are waiting on the Mexican side of the border, hoping to enter the U.S. Caitlin?
Camilo at the border, thank you. For more on this, Margaret Brennan and Scott MacFarlane join us now. Margaret is CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and, of course, moderator of Face the Nation. And Scott is a CBS News Congressional Correspondent. I do want to get to immigration as soon as we can. But, Scott, we have some news, I understand, on this debt ceiling meeting that has now been postponed. We're expecting all of the leaders to meet tomorrow. What's the latest?
I've been speaking with congressional sources who confirm what we're also hearing out of the White House, that what was supposed to be a meeting of the principals tomorrow, the president and congressional leaders, has been pushed back to next week. That's often a sign of progress on negotiations and on legislation, because that means the staff is talking. That means there's some productivity or some need for the staff to continue talking before you bring the bosses back together. This will be rescheduled for next week. What was supposed to be a week-ending debt ceiling summit will now be next week's debt ceiling summit. But, Caitlin, the timing on this is all critical. June 1st is the deadline, the X date, and it's quickly approaching.
Yeah, with a limited time that Congress is actually in session between now and then. We'll come back to you, Scott. Margaret, I want to talk about immigration and Title 42. You interviewed Secretary Mayorkas over the weekend. Earlier today, he was talking at the White House and telling reporters that they've been making this message clear that migrants should not come. He said, quote, "Our borders are not open." But clearly that message isn't being received because we're seeing this surge. What is contributing to that surge?
Gosh, it's a huge question. This is a global crisis. There are 100 million people who are displaced worldwide, according to the UN. 100 million. We haven't seen a migration crisis like this since World War II. So you have to think about that, the strain on resources worldwide that's happening, the amount of people seeking asylum in places like the United States, and then you look at what's happening on the border. And it really just draws into stark relief that the crisis level influx we are at a time when the politics is broken, the system is not built to take this in, and the problems aren't going away. So the pressure is only continuing to build. In terms of why people are fleeing, that 100 million number, a lot of that is fueled by the war in Ukraine, yes. But then you look at what's happening at our border right now, not people landing at airports and asking to stay here as refugees, but people who are physically making that trek. It's no longer just Mexico and Central America, places that are of proximity to the United States. They are as far-flung as Venezuela, 5,000 miles away. You have people also making that trek by flying from China or flying from Europe to places like Nicaragua. Cubans coming into the United States by going to Nicaragua, getting a visa, and then coming up through. So they are looking for ways to come to the United States, and not all of what we are seeing is not going through a legal process. That is to say, claiming asylum is a legal process. Right. People have to show up at a port of entry and say, there's credible fear for my life and my safety. And that's where they ask to be put into a system that is not built to move swiftly right now. And that's what Mayorkas, the Homeland Security Secretary, is talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these systems are so strained. And then meanwhile, you have cities essentially, issuing states of emergency almost because they are expecting these the surge. Mayorkas also, kind of addressed that today. He said, "I can't overstate the strain on our personnel and our facilities." Part of what they're trying to do, too, is set up these processing centers for those migrants who are trying to claim asylum now that the policy has changed. Do you have a sense of timeline, like what that would actually look like? Is that possible?
Well, there are many levels of problems and criticism to be layered here. When it comes to trying to unclog the border, that's what these processing centers are being set up for, to put people through legal pathways before they get to the United States. Those processing centers aren't open for business there this week. They may not be open for business for many weeks, according to what Secretary Mayorkas told me on Sunday. Today at the White House podium, he even sort of gave themselves a little bit more wiggle room there to say it's going to take time. And I know from talking to international organizations and talking to the UN, we'll be in there helping to set these up. This is asking a foreign government, whether it's Ecuador, which has been reluctant to say yes quickly, Colombia, which has been much more friendly to the U.S. and is likely to be the first place we see one of these processing centers open. It's opening a facility on foreign soil staffed not just by the United States, but also these international organizations like those who process refugees in the Middle East who are from the UN. That's what we're talking about, a refugee crisis. And so they are doing those interviews theoretically in these places that aren't set up for business yet. There are other pathways through applications online, through other methods you can apply for asylum. But when you hear Secretary Mayorkas say the system's broken, he's pointing the finger back at Congress saying, if you don't like the way the asylum law is written, if it's too open and loosey-goosey and anyone can come and claim it, change the law. And you haven't in decades. So they just continue to point fingers back and forth at each other. But that's where we are at a time when the scale of the problem has never been bigger.
And I mean, to that point, Scott, this broken immigration system, you hear lawmakers talk about that over and over again. I know House Republicans passed a measure today. Tell us a little bit more about that and kind of the general appetite or lack thereof, really, on Capitol Hill for any kind of broader immigration reforms.
It was no coincidence the day Title 42 expires, the U.S. House Republican majority had a vote on their border security bill, which would increase border agents nationwide, would increase the technology used at the border, and continue the construction of the border wall. Party line vote. It's dead on arrival in the U.S. Senate, but Republicans told me they hope this furthers the conversation and forces the administration to perhaps sit down with Republicans in Congress and try to negotiate something very symmetrical to the debt ceiling bill that was passed recently. They're hoping to prod a negotiation. All that being said, Democrats have kicked back, saying what Republicans did today in Congress was weaponize this issue and villainize migrants trying to enter the United States. Take a listen to some of the interviews we did late this afternoon.
It's inhumane. You know, asylum seekers are people. They are human beings escaping some disastrous circumstances that we have been a part of creating over many, many years of how we have harmed Central and South America. That's why they're migrating here.
Already have is a massive southern border crisis, and you have the end of Title 42 turns that crisis into a full-scale invasion. We've effectively given over the southern border of the United States to Mexican drug cartels.
We spent this day tracking the moderate Republicans, those in Biden-won districts, to see where they were on this, and they were messaging a lot on fentanyl, that this bill will help reduce the amount of fentanyl that comes into their communities. That is a politically advantageous argument to make, they believe. We pressed one of them, an upstate New York Republican, about that allegation from his New York colleague that this bill villainizes migrants. Take a listen to this. This seems like a messaging bill, and the Senate doesn't have any interest in taking this up. So what does this bill ultimately accomplish?
I cannot imagine a Republican or Democrat senator or member of the House of Representatives who doesn't see this today as a real crisis, a safety and security crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a drug crisis. The fact that there are some who don't want to acknowledge it is problematic in its own right. And so what we're simply saying is that we can secure our border safely, we can be compassionate in how we deal with those who want to enter our country, and we can save lives by confronting fentanyl.
Caitlin, no prospect of bipartisan agreement on any of this.
Yeah, of course. This has been the issue that has been among the most elusive on Capitol Hill in terms of getting any success and bipartisan accomplishments here. We will continue to cover it. Margaret, Brennan, and Scott MacFarlane, thank you both for your time and reporting.